James Carter had always felt a special connection to the little lake cabin his family owned. It was not just a building, it was a place full of memories. He remembered the first time his father took him there, a young boy of only 8, eager to explore the small wooden dock and the calm waters that stretched before him like a mirror. The cabin had always been more than a vacation spot, it was a retreat from the busy city life, a place where time seemed to slow down and worries felt smaller. On weekends, he would spend hours fishing, sometimes catching nothing, sometimes catching enough to cook a small dinner by the lake, but it never mattered because the joy of being there was what counted most. Over the years, the cabin had hosted family reunions, summer barbecues, and quiet nights under a sky so full of stars that it felt like the universe had come close just to be part of their lives. As an adult, James took care of the cabin as if it were part of himself. He painted it when the wood started to age, repaired the small fence around the yard, and made sure the dock was sturdy. He enjoyed seeing the cabin remain in good condition, a symbol of his family's history and the values they had passed down through generations. James often thought about how lucky he was to have such a place, a private corner of peace in a world that was often loud and stressful. He also knew that he had responsibilities. Living in a neighborhood governed by a homeowners association meant following certain rules, and James always tried to respect them, believing that harmony with neighbors was just as important as caring for his cabin. But life had a way of introducing challenges, and not all of them were about weathering storms or repairing wooden walls. Sometimes, challenges came in the form of people, and that was exactly what happened when Karen Whitman became a prominent figure in the neighborhood. Karen was known for her strong personality and her ability to influence the HOA board. From the moment she arrived, she seemed determined to ensure that the rules of the community were followed, though not always in ways that seemed fair. She had a way of presenting herself as calm and polite, but those who had dealings with her often found that she could be surprisingly strict, especially when it involved matters that might affect her family. Her son, Brad, was a young man just out of college, eager to make a name for himself. Brad looked up to his mother and often followed her guidance without question. Together, they formed a presence in the neighborhood that many found intimidating, even if they were polite on the surface. At first, James tried to interact with them as he did with all neighbors, friendly greetings, small talk about the weather or the lake, and occasional invitations to join for a weekend fish fry. But he began to notice subtle signs that Karen was watching his actions closely. She questioned small things that he had never been asked about before. "Why is your grass a little taller than the rule allows?" she would ask. "Why are there extra chairs on the deck?" she would point out. At first, James brushed these comments off, thinking it was just her attention to detail. He tried to stay calm, knowing that reacting with anger would only make matters worse. Still, he could not help but feel uneasy, sensing that something deeper was brewing, though he couldn't yet see the full picture. Brad, meanwhile, seemed eager to follow in his mother's footsteps. He would occasionally come to the cabin, often carrying measuring tape or taking photos, and ask questions about the property as if preparing for an inspection. James tried to remain patient, explaining that everything was in good order and that there was nothing to worry about. Despite this, he could not shake the feeling that their interest was more than casual. It felt as if his long years of care and attention to the cabin were being quietly judged and, in a way, threatened. Friends who visited James began to notice the tension as well. They would make comments like, "It feels like they are keeping score," or "You've been here for decades, and they're acting like strangers have more rights." These observations only reinforced James's growing concern that he needed to be vigilant. As weeks passed, the tension in the neighborhood became more noticeable. Karen attended every HOA meeting, often speaking at length about rules and procedures, presenting herself as the voice of fairness and order. James, who had always attended meetings to stay informed, began to realize that the way Karen presented facts was sometimes selective. She would emphasize minor rule violations by others while ignoring small things that benefited her family. While he could not openly accuse her of favoritism, the pattern was clear. James began documenting his own interactions carefully, keeping notes on conversations and taking photographs when necessary. He knew that being prepared for any challenge could make the difference if things escalated. Despite the growing unease, James tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. He continued his weekend visits to the cabin, fishing in the early morning, and cooking dinners on the dock. He cherished the quiet moments, the feeling of water lapping against the wood, and the wind rustling through the trees. These simple pleasures reminded him why he loved the cabin so much and why he was determined to protect it. At the same time, he understood that vigilance was now a part of his routine. The joy of the cabin was now mixed with caution, a reminder that even peaceful places could become battlegrounds when human ambitions and misunderstandings collided. Neighbors began to whisper among themselves. Some expressed concern about Karen's influence and her frequent presence at HOA meetings. Others tried to remain neutral, not wanting to get involved in disputes that did not directly affect them. James, however, knew that neutrality was no longer an option. He had a personal stake in the outcome, and his family's legacy was at risk. He resolved to handle the situation with calm determination, relying on facts, community support, and legal guidance if necessary. He understood that losing control of the cabin would not only be an emotional blow but also a violation of his family's history. Amid this tension, Karen's son Brad became more active. He visited the cabin more frequently, asking questions about boundaries and rules in a way that felt increasingly intrusive. James tried to remain polite, explaining that everything was in compliance with HOA regulations. But the sense of intrusion was growing. Brad's visits were no longer friendly or casual, they had the tone of observation and preparation. James could feel that a change was coming, though he could not predict exactly how it would unfold. The quiet happiness he once felt at the cabin now included a shadow of concern. Every creak of the floorboards, every knock on the door, reminded him that he needed to stay alert. As the summer progressed, small incidents began to accumulate. Complaints were filed about minor landscaping details, about the placement of garden furniture, and even about the types of flowers in James's yard. While he knew these were trivial, he realized that the pattern was deliberate. Karen's influence over the HOA gave her power to challenge him repeatedly, and James began to see that her actions were more than mere rule enforcement, they were targeted. Friends advised him to prepare for the possibility that things could escalate, but James remained cautious, determined to respond thoughtfully rather than with anger. He knew that losing composure could make him appear unreasonable, which could strengthen Karen's position. Through it all, James kept returning to the lake. The cabin remained his sanctuary, a place where he could breathe and think clearly. The water reflected not just the sky but also his determination. He knew that the challenges ahead would test his patience and resolve, but he was committed to protecting what was rightfully his. He continued to maintain the cabin meticulously, welcoming friends and family, and enjoying the moments of peace that were still possible. Even as tension mounted, James's connection to the lake and the cabin remained strong, a source of strength that reminded him why he had to persevere. By the end of the summer, it became clear that the situation with Karen and Brad was far from ordinary. What had begun as small observations and complaints had grown into a sense of threat, a realization that his beloved cabin might soon be challenged in ways he could not yet fully predict. James understood that he needed to prepare for whatever was coming, relying on patience, careful documentation, and the support of neighbors who shared his concern. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test his resilience and determination, but he felt ready. After all, the lake cabin had always been more than just property, it was a symbol of family, memory, and the quiet power of standing firm in the face of injustice. The early days of summer had passed, and James Carter continued to enjoy the quiet moments at his lake cabin, though a sense of unease had settled in the back of his mind. The tension with Karen Whitman and her son Brad had been simmering for months, but James still hoped it might resolve itself peacefully. Unfortunately, he soon realized that hope alone could not protect him or his property. What followed shook not only him but the entire neighborhood. It started with a letter. James received it one afternoon while sitting on the cabin's small porch, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the sun glitter on the water. The letter was from the HOA, but it was unlike any correspondence he had received before. In calm, official language, it stated that the cabin he had inherited and cared for all his life was now, according to HOA records, under the ownership of Brad Whitman. The letter explained that this change had been approved by the HOA board and cited obscure rules about property rights and community management. James read the letter again and again, hoping he had misunderstood. But every word was clear: the cabin was no longer his. Shock and disbelief washed over him. He had grown up loving that cabin. He had spent decades maintaining it, creating memories with his family, and now, in a matter of days, it was being handed to someone else, someone who had barely lived in the neighborhood. James could feel his heart pounding, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that losing control of the cabin could not happen quietly. He could not let emotions take over because he needed to think clearly. He decided to investigate the matter thoroughly, determined to understand how the HOA had allowed such a transfer to occur. James began by reviewing HOA documents, meeting minutes, and property records. He quickly noticed irregularities. Certain votes had been recorded without proper notification to all homeowners, and rules that normally required a transparent process seemed to have been bypassed. The more he examined the documents, the more it appeared that Karen had influenced the board behind the scenes. Her reputation for control and manipulation made the pieces fit together in a way that was impossible to ignore. James felt a mix of frustration and anger, but he also felt clarity. This was not a simple mistake, it was a deliberate move that he needed to challenge carefully. Neighbors began to notice the sudden shift in James's routine. He stopped going out for casual walks as often, instead spending hours reviewing records and documenting every communication from the HOA. Friends who came to visit found him tense but composed, determined to stay focused on resolving the situation. He shared his findings cautiously, asking for advice and guidance, knowing that allies in the community would be essential if he hoped to reclaim the cabin. Some neighbors expressed shock and anger at the unfairness of the transfer, but others were hesitant to get involved, worried about crossing Karen, whose influence over the HOA was well known. Meanwhile, Brad Whitman, now officially the cabin's owner on paper, began to act as though nothing had changed. He visited the cabin frequently, inspecting the property and taking notes on everything he could see. James observed him from a distance, careful not to engage in any confrontations that could escalate into legal complications. Brad's behavior was bold, almost arrogant, as if ownership alone gave him the right to control every detail of a place he had barely known before. James reminded himself that this was a battle of patience and strategy. He could not allow anger or rash decisions to jeopardize his chance to regain the cabin. Karen, for her part, remained composed in public, attending HOA meetings and giving speeches about fairness and rule enforcement. She portrayed the transfer as a necessary step for the community, insisting that her son would uphold the standards she had fought to implement. James listened carefully during these meetings, noting the selective way rules were applied and the persuasive manner in which Karen deflected questions. It was clear that she was using every tool at her disposal to legitimize what was, in reality, an unjust action. Feeling the weight of the situation, James sought professional advice. He contacted a local attorney who specialized in property and HOA disputes. The attorney carefully reviewed the case and confirmed James's suspicions: there were serious procedural errors in the transfer, and the board had acted in ways that could be legally challenged. James felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. He realized that reclaiming the cabin would require careful planning, documentation, and a willingness to stand firm against the combined influence of Karen and her son. But he was ready. Losing the cabin was not an option. The memories, history, and emotional connection were far too important to give up. At the same time, the community's awareness of the situation began to grow. Word spread among neighbors that something unusual had occurred with James's cabin. While some residents remained neutral, many were outraged at the perceived misuse of HOA authority. Conversations at local gatherings, coffee shops, and even the marina where people docked their boats became centered around the unfairness of the cabin transfer. James realized that public attention could be a powerful ally, showing the HOA that residents were paying attention and would hold them accountable. However, he also knew that he had to balance community involvement carefully, ensuring that he maintained credibility and avoided being seen as confrontational or emotional. Brad's attitude began to shift as he realized that James was not going to quietly accept the transfer. He started to push boundaries in subtle ways, making minor changes to the property, rearranging furniture, and occasionally leaving notes implying that James no longer had a say in the cabin's maintenance. These small acts were designed to assert authority and perhaps to intimidate James, but they also revealed Brad's lack of understanding of the deep emotional connection James had to the cabin. James responded with calm documentation, photographing changes, and keeping written records of every incident. He knew that each detail could become important if the dispute escalated to a legal battle. As summer continued, James's daily visits to the cabin became more purposeful. He would inspect the property carefully, ensuring that no permanent alterations were made without his knowledge. He spoke with neighbors discreetly, gathering information and learning about similar incidents where HOA rules had been misapplied. The more he learned, the more confident he became that he could challenge the transfer successfully. The situation, while stressful, also strengthened James's resolve and sharpened his understanding of community dynamics, legal procedures, and strategic planning. One evening, after a long day of reviewing documents and speaking with legal advisors, James sat on the dock, letting the cool lake breeze calm his mind. He reflected on the years he had spent at the cabin, the memories of his parents teaching him to fish, the summer nights filled with laughter, and the quiet mornings watching the sun rise over the water. He realized that this connection was the core of his determination. No amount of power or influence could erase the bond he had with the cabin. He promised himself that he would fight for it, not out of anger, but out of respect for his family's history and the values they had instilled in him. Meanwhile, Karen and Brad began to sense that James would not be an easy opponent. Their initial confidence, built on their influence and the apparent support of the HOA board, started to waver as James prepared to assert his rights. Karen continued her public displays of composure, but behind the scenes, there were signs of concern. She began consulting with advisors and reviewing the legal steps she had taken, realizing that James's careful documentation and community support could challenge the legitimacy of the cabin transfer. Brad, still young and inexperienced, started to show signs of frustration. The bold confidence he displayed earlier was now tempered by the reality that his claim to the cabin might not be uncontested. The summer's heat began to fade, and with it came a quiet anticipation. James continued his routine, visiting the cabin, maintaining the property, and documenting every development. He knew that the coming weeks would likely bring formal challenges, meetings, and perhaps even legal action. But he remained calm, determined to handle each step with patience and precision. The cabin, with its wooden walls, familiar furniture, and the gentle sound of the lake, remained his anchor. It was not just a house, it was a symbol of perseverance, history, and the quiet strength that comes from standing up for what is right. By the end of the season, the situation had grown from a shocking transfer into a fully recognized dispute. James had positioned himself as a careful, reasonable, and determined defender of his property. He had built support among neighbors, gathered legal advice, and prepared to challenge the actions of Karen and Brad. The stage was set for a confrontation, but James felt ready. He understood that the outcome would not be determined by anger or force, but by patience, careful planning, and the willingness to assert his rights thoughtfully and persistently. Despite the challenges, James still found moments of peace. Fishing early in the morning, watching the sun rise over the lake, and feeling the familiar breeze on his face reminded him why the cabin mattered so deeply. The conflict had changed the way he approached life at the lake, adding a sense of vigilance and awareness, but it had not diminished his love for the place. In fact, it strengthened it, reinforcing the idea that some things are worth fighting for, not with violence or aggression, but with dignity, preparation, and determination. By the time autumn arrived, the tension surrounding James Carter's lake cabin had grown to a level that no one in the community could ignore. James had spent the summer carefully documenting every move, every letter, and every unusual action taken by the HOA and the Whitmans. His patience, focus, and meticulous record-keeping had begun to make an impression, not only on his neighbors but also on the local authorities he had consulted. However, what happened next would push the situation into completely uncharted territory and test James's resolve like never before. It began with a phone call from one of the neighboring property owners. The voice on the line was calm but urgent. "James," the neighbor said, "you might want to take a look at what Brad is doing at the cabin. He's building something." At first, James assumed it was just minor repairs or routine maintenance, but the urgency in the neighbor's voice made him uneasy. Without waiting, he grabbed his jacket and drove to the lake, hoping that it wasn't another escalation. As he approached the cabin, he noticed construction materials stacked near the fence line. Wood, nails, and rolls of metal fencing had been delivered earlier that morning. The air smelled faintly of fresh-cut timber and the sharp tang of metal. James's heart sank as he saw the scope of what Brad had started. The young man, armed with tools and an air of authority, was erecting a fence not just around the cabin itself but extending far beyond the property boundaries. The fence was being built in straight, careful lines, stretching across open areas, dipping into shared community land, and heading directly toward the HOA's main office, a small brick building near the entrance of the neighborhood. James blinked, certain that he was seeing things wrong, but there was no mistake. Brad had somehow decided to mark his dominance by fencing the property in a way that connected it symbolically and perhaps legally to the HOA headquarters. Neighbors began to gather quietly at the edges of the construction site. Some whispered among themselves, clearly unsure how to react. Others watched in stunned silence, realizing that this was no ordinary act of property maintenance. Brad's actions were provocative, almost theatrical, designed to assert power and intimidate James, and possibly the rest of the community. James took a deep breath, calming his rising anger. He knew he had to respond strategically, not emotionally. He started taking photos and videos, documenting every section of the fence as it went up. He noted each time Brad or his friends moved tools or adjusted the layout. Brad noticed James immediately. "You're still here," he called out, his voice loud enough to carry across the construction site. "You should be out of this. This is my property now." James remained composed. "This is still my home," he replied calmly. "And I am documenting what you are doing. You need to stop until we have proper authorization." Brad laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "Authorization? I've got all the papers I need. The HOA approved this. Move along, old man." The confrontation was brief, but James knew the real battle was just beginning. Words alone would not stop the fence, but careful documentation could give him the legal and public leverage he needed. As the day went on, Brad worked with a small crew of helpers, moving quickly to extend the fence along the planned route. James stayed nearby, silently recording every action and ensuring that no one could claim he had ignored or condoned the activity. He noticed that Brad's crew sometimes cut corners, driving stakes into areas that technically belonged to other residents or the community as a whole. This careless behavior gave James further evidence that the fence was not just a boundary, it was a power play, violating rules and overstepping legal rights. By late afternoon, the fence had reached a surprising length, moving through common areas, along roadsides, and edging dangerously close to other private properties. The community's murmurs grew louder. Residents who had once been unsure now began to express concern openly. "This is insane," one neighbor muttered. "Where is the HOA in all of this?" Another added, "It's like he thinks he owns the whole neighborhood." James could see the anxiety on everyone's faces, but he also noticed something else, a quiet admiration for his composure. While Brad was making bold, reckless moves, James's calm, methodical approach stood in stark contrast, showing everyone that reason and patience were stronger than aggression. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, James took a walk along the partially completed fence. He counted the stakes, measured the lengths, and noted the encroachments into public areas. He realized that if Brad completed this audacious plan, he would have a physical presence that symbolically connected the cabin to the HOA office. It was a bold move, likely intended to intimidate James and the neighbors, but it also created a vulnerability. The fence's irregular placement, combined with James's careful documentation, could be used as evidence in court. The next day, James consulted with his attorney. "This is beyond anything I've seen before," the attorney said, scrolling through photos and measurements James had provided. "He's trying to create a legal argument based on physical presence, but he's clearly violating multiple rules and possibly trespassing. The key is that we have every detail documented. You need to keep calm, continue recording, and involve the community." James nodded. The plan became clear. He would continue monitoring the fence, engage neighbors, and prepare for the next formal steps. The audacity of Brad's actions did not intimidate him, instead, it strengthened his resolve. Brad, unaware of the growing support behind James, continued construction with growing frustration. By the third day, a section of the fence had reached almost halfway to the HOA office. Onlookers whispered, watching the situation unfold with a mix of fascination and concern. Brad appeared determined to finish the project, as though completing the fence would solidify his claim permanently. He was acting like a boy who had discovered a new power without fully understanding its consequences. James, meanwhile, continued to gather evidence, speaking discreetly with neighbors who had clear views of the construction site. Some residents even began offering assistance, suggesting ways to document activity and maintain community awareness without direct confrontation. One afternoon, James confronted Brad directly, walking up to the partially completed fence. "Brad," he said calmly, "this is not your property to extend like this. You are violating HOA rules, trespassing on community land, and creating problems for everyone. You need to stop now." Brad smirked, raising his hammer. "You're just bitter because you lost. The board approved this. I'm within my rights." James didn't respond with anger. Instead, he simply recorded the conversation on his phone, capturing Brad's admission of intent and his belief that the transfer gave him unchecked authority. Every word was a piece of the puzzle, a layer of protection for James should this conflict escalate further. As the days passed, more neighbors joined James's quiet campaign. They shared observations, photos, and historical knowledge of the property boundaries. Some even spoke with the local media, highlighting the unusual nature of the situation. The story began to gain attention beyond the small lake community. Articles and social media posts described the audacity of the fence extending toward the HOA office, the legal questions raised, and the ongoing battle between a dedicated homeowner and the powerful Whitman family. James remained composed, ensuring that all public statements were factual, calm, and devoid of emotion. This careful approach reinforced his credibility and highlighted the reckless nature of Brad's actions. By the end of the week, the fence was nearly complete, extending close to the HOA office itself. The sight of the long wooden barrier stretching across shared lands and near public areas created a sense of surreal tension. It was an audacious act of defiance, but it also created new vulnerabilities for Brad and the HOA. James realized that the physical presence of the fence, combined with the thorough documentation he had collected, could become a turning point. He now had the evidence to demonstrate not just procedural errors but also reckless and potentially illegal behavior. That evening, as the sun set over the lake, James sat on the dock reflecting on the week's events. The conflict had escalated far beyond his initial fears. Brad's fence, which had started as a simple construction project, had become a symbol of power, entitlement, and the length some people would go to assert dominance. But James also recognized the strength in his own response: patience, careful observation, and a commitment to doing what was right. He felt a deep sense of determination, knowing that the next steps would require legal action, community support, and strategic planning. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the deep oranges and reds of the autumn sky. James took a deep breath, letting the tranquility of the scene calm his mind. He understood that the fence was only a physical barrier, but it could not break the connection he had to his home. He promised himself that he would fight, not with anger or rash decisions, but with patience, careful planning, and the unwavering belief that truth and fairness would ultimately prevail. The next morning, James woke up early, feeling the crisp autumn air settle over the lake. The events of the past week weighed heavily on him, but he knew he had reached a turning point. Brad's fence was nearly complete, stretching boldly across shared lands and almost touching the HOA office. It was clear that if he did not act quickly, this barrier could become an accepted part of the landscape, giving Brad and the HOA a dangerous sense of legitimacy. James realized that patience and documentation had brought him this far, but now it was time to take more formal action. After breakfast, he gathered all the evidence he had collected: photographs, videos, measurements, and notes detailing the timeline of construction. Each item was organized meticulously, ensuring that there was a clear and undeniable record of Brad's actions. He even included statements from neighbors who had observed the fence being built on shared land and near properties that were not part of Brad's ownership. James felt a sense of confidence seeing all the evidence laid out before him. It was more than proof, it was a story, a record of intent, recklessness, and disregard for community rules. With the evidence ready, James scheduled a meeting with his attorney. As he walked into the office, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. His attorney greeted him warmly, already aware of the situation from previous discussions. "James," the attorney said, "we have a strong case, but it needs to be handled carefully. This isn't just about a fence. It's about property rights, community boundaries, and the way authority has been misused. If we present everything clearly, the court will see the truth." James nodded, understanding that this was no longer a personal battle but a legal and moral one. The first step was to file a formal complaint with the local authorities. James prepared a detailed report, including all the evidence he had gathered, along with a clear explanation of the problem. He described how Brad's fence encroached on shared lands, violated HOA rules, and threatened the integrity of the community. The report was calm, factual, and precise, leaving no room for exaggeration or emotional bias. James submitted the complaint to the local zoning office, the HOA board, and even the municipal authorities responsible for property disputes. He wanted every responsible body to be aware of the situation. Once the complaint was filed, James turned his attention to the community. He held a small meeting at his cabin, inviting neighbors who had expressed concern about the fence. The gathering was informal, with chairs arranged around a warm fireplace and cups of tea and coffee being passed around. James spoke calmly, showing photos and videos of the fence, explaining the legal steps he was taking, and highlighting the importance of community awareness. The neighbors listened attentively, nodding in agreement. Some offered to provide additional statements or assist in documenting any further construction. It was a moment of quiet solidarity, a reminder that the strength of a community lay in cooperation and shared purpose. Brad, meanwhile, seemed unaware of the growing organized response. He continued working on the fence, sometimes alone and sometimes with a few helpers, adding height and reinforcing sections that appeared vulnerable. His movements were deliberate, almost performative, as if he wanted everyone to see his power. Yet, with each nail hammered and each stake driven into the ground, he was also creating more evidence against himself. James could see it clearly: Every action taken by Brad added to the story of recklessness and disregard for the law. A week after the complaint was submitted, James received a call from the local authorities. They informed him that they would conduct an inspection of the property and the surrounding land. James felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The visit could validate all the work he had done in documenting Brad's actions. He prepared thoroughly, reviewing notes, ensuring that all measurements were accurate, and confirming that neighbors were ready to provide statements if needed. This was the moment where careful planning would meet official scrutiny. On the day of the inspection, James met the officials at the cabin. Brad was there too, standing near the fence with an air of defiance. The inspectors walked along the fence line, taking photographs, measuring distances, and comparing them to official property maps. They asked questions, noting every encroachment and irregularity. James answered calmly, providing evidence and clarifying details without letting anger or frustration show. Brad attempted to interject several times, claiming ownership and authority, but the inspectors remained focused on the facts. By the end of the inspection, it was clear that the fence violated several regulations and encroached upon shared land and neighboring properties. With the inspection completed, James and his attorney began preparing the next steps. They drafted a formal request to the HOA board, demanding the immediate removal or modification of the fence. The letter was precise, backed by evidence, and emphasized the legal consequences of non-compliance. James understood that Brad's actions were not just reckless but potentially costly for the HOA as well, and he was careful to frame the letter in a way that appealed to both legality and practicality. As the days passed, the tension in the community continued to build. Neighbors watched closely, some offering support and others simply observing. Brad, however, grew increasingly frustrated. His initial confidence began to waver as he realized that James had not only documented everything but had also mobilized both legal authorities and community support. The young man's attempts at intimidation were losing their effectiveness. Each new phone call from the HOA office, each note from the authorities, and each neighbor's statement chipped away at the wall of control he had tried to build. James also made sure to involve local media in a controlled and responsible way. He provided clear, factual information, focusing on the fence's impact on the community and the legal steps being taken. Articles were published highlighting the unusual nature of the dispute and the importance of following proper procedures. Public attention added a new layer of pressure on Brad and the HOA, reminding them that reckless actions had consequences beyond the immediate neighborhood. One afternoon, James received a call from a representative of the HOA. The voice was measured but firm. "Mr. Carter, we have reviewed the situation and the evidence you provided. We recognize that there have been violations and that the current fence placement is unacceptable. We need to meet to discuss how this can be resolved." James felt a wave of cautious optimism. The careful documentation, community support, and legal strategy were beginning to yield results. The meeting with the HOA board was scheduled for the following week. James prepared meticulously, bringing all evidence, photographs, videos, and statements from neighbors. He rehearsed his points, ensuring that he could present them clearly and calmly. On the day of the meeting, the board members listened as James laid out the situation, explaining the legal and community implications of the fence. Brad was present as well, his confident demeanor faltering slightly as James methodically presented the facts. After hours of discussion, the board reached a decision. They acknowledged that Brad had overstepped his authority, that the fence violated community rules, and that it encroached on shared land. The board directed Brad to remove or modify the fence immediately, restoring property boundaries to their proper state. Additionally, they established stricter oversight for any future construction projects to prevent similar conflicts. James felt a deep sense of relief and quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, not through anger or confrontation, but through careful planning, documentation, and steadfast commitment to the truth. That evening, James walked along the edge of the property, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The fence, once a symbol of intimidation and audacity, had become a reminder of the power of patience, evidence, and community support. Neighbors stopped by, offering congratulations and sharing their appreciation for his calm and determined approach. The lake reflected the colors of the sunset, peaceful and serene, a stark contrast to the tension of the past weeks. James understood that this experience had taught him valuable lessons. He had learned the importance of careful observation, the power of documentation, and the strength that comes from involving others in a common cause. Most importantly, he realized that patience and calm, combined with strategic action, could overcome even the boldest displays of power. As he looked across the lake, he felt a renewed sense of connection to his home and community, confident that he had not only defended his property but also strengthened the bonds of trust and respect among neighbors. After the HOA board meeting, James felt a quiet sense of relief, but he knew the work was not entirely over. Brad still needed to remove or modify the fence, and there was always the possibility of pushback or delays. Determined to see the resolution through, James maintained regular communication with the HOA representatives, checking on their progress and ensuring that Brad followed the board's instructions. He remained calm and patient, understanding that persistence was key in achieving a final, lasting outcome. Within a few days, the first signs of change appeared. Brad had started to dismantle the sections of the fence that encroached on shared land. His movements were slow and careful, and he was noticeably less confrontational than before. James observed from a distance, documenting the process to ensure there would be no future disputes about compliance. The neighborhood watched closely, relieved to see that the situation was being corrected without further conflict. It was a small victory, but an important one, symbolizing the restoration of order and fairness. As Brad worked, James continued to strengthen the community ties that had been so essential during the dispute. He organized small gatherings at the lake, inviting neighbors to share meals, stories, and laughter. These gatherings were simple but meaningful: picnics by the water, evening walks along the shore, and casual conversations about life and nature. Through these moments, James realized that the conflict had inadvertently brought the community closer together. Neighbors who had once been distant or reserved were now more willing to support each other, share information, and act collectively when needed. While the fence was being dismantled, James also focused on documenting the entire journey. He created a detailed record of the events, including photographs, written notes, and video clips. This record was not just for legal purposes but also as a reminder of the lessons learned and the strategies that had proven effective. James understood that knowledge was power, and by keeping a thorough account of the experience, he could help others in similar situations navigate challenges with patience, clarity, and confidence. The dismantling process took several days, and James remained patient throughout. Brad occasionally attempted to argue or stall, but the HOA representatives were firm, reminding him of the board's decision and the legal implications of non-compliance. Eventually, the fence was fully removed from shared lands, and only a small portion remained within Brad's legitimate property boundaries. The sight of the restored open space brought a sense of calm and satisfaction to James and the neighbors alike. It was a visual representation of justice, fairness, and the power of careful, determined action. Once the physical conflict was resolved, James turned his attention to the lessons and reflections that the experience had offered. He realized that his calm and methodical approach had been his greatest strength. By documenting every step, involving authorities and the community, and avoiding confrontational behavior, he had managed to overcome a challenge that initially seemed overwhelming. James understood that anger and retaliation might have escalated the situation, but patience, clarity, and evidence had achieved lasting results. James also reflected on the importance of community support. Throughout the ordeal, neighbors had provided statements, observations, and encouragement, reinforcing the idea that collective action can protect individual rights. He felt grateful for the way people had come together, setting aside personal differences to uphold fairness and integrity. The conflict had not only resolved a property dispute but had also strengthened relationships, trust, and communication within the neighborhood. In addition, James considered the broader implications of the experience. He recognized that authority can be misused, sometimes in subtle or unexpected ways, and that vigilance and documentation are essential in protecting one's rights. At the same time, he saw that legal processes and responsible institutions are capable of correcting imbalances and ensuring justice. This understanding gave him confidence that future challenges, while inevitable, could be faced with clarity, preparation, and resilience. Brad's behavior changed noticeably after the resolution. He no longer attempted to assert dominance or intimidate neighbors. While he still maintained his property, his approach became more cautious and respectful. The community observed this shift, understanding that actions had consequences, and that accountability was not something to be ignored. Brad's compliance served as a reminder that fairness, when pursued thoughtfully, could influence even those who initially resisted it. As the lake returned to its peaceful state, James found joy in simple moments once again. He spent time fishing, walking along the shore, and enjoying the quiet reflections of the water. The sunsets, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the laughter of neighbors became symbols of harmony and balance, contrasting sharply with the tension and uncertainty of previous weeks. These moments reminded him that life continued beyond conflict, and that patience and perseverance could restore not only property boundaries but also a sense of peace and community. James also began sharing his experience with others beyond the neighborhood. He spoke at local gatherings and community meetings, explaining how careful documentation, calm communication, and legal awareness had been crucial in resolving the dispute. People listened attentively, asking questions and taking notes, eager to learn from his experience. James felt a sense of purpose in sharing these lessons, realizing that his journey could help others navigate challenges with integrity and confidence. In the final weeks, James took steps to prevent similar conflicts from arising in the future. He worked with the HOA to establish clearer guidelines for property boundaries, construction approvals, and community communications. These measures ensured that all residents had a clear understanding of rules and procedures, reducing the likelihood of misunderstandings or overreach. The new policies were practical, fair, and inclusive, reflecting the lessons learned from the fence dispute. The resolution of the fence conflict became a quiet source of pride for James and the neighborhood. It was a story of perseverance, fairness, and the power of evidence-based action. Neighbors often spoke of the experience as a turning point, a moment when the community came together to protect shared values and property rights. James felt proud not only of the outcome but also of the way he had handled the challenge with patience, clarity, and unwavering commitment to justice. Looking back, James realized that the experience had changed him in subtle but important ways. He had learned to approach conflicts strategically, to value community support, and to recognize the importance of documentation and evidence. He understood that power could be exercised responsibly or abused, and that vigilance, clarity, and calm action were essential in ensuring fairness. These lessons became a part of his daily life, shaping how he interacted with neighbors, authorities, and his own sense of responsibility. In the end, the lake cabin, once at the center of conflict, returned to being a place of peace, reflection, and community connection. James could enjoy the quiet mornings, the sparkling water, and the warmth of friendly neighbors without fear or tension. The fence, now gone, had left behind more than just open space. It had left a story of resilience, fairness, and the enduring power of calm, thoughtful action. James often walked along the edge of the lake, reflecting on the journey that had begun with a simple act of overreach and ended with justice and harmony. He realized that challenges were a part of life, but with patience, preparation, and the support of others, even the most daunting situations could be resolved. The lake reflected the sky above, clear and serene, symbolizing not just the restoration of property but the restoration of balance, fairness, and peace within the community. As seasons changed and time passed, James continued to cherish the lake, the neighbors, and the lessons learned. He maintained the records of the dispute, not out of anger or resentment, but as a testament to the power of perseverance, clarity, and integrity. The story of the fence became part of local lore, a reminder that fairness, patience, and thoughtful action could overcome audacity and overreach, leaving the community stronger and more connected than before. James's experience left a lasting impact, shaping his sense of responsibility, his approach to challenges, and his connection to the neighborhood. The lake cabin, the community, and the bonds formed during the conflict remain symbols of resilience, justice, and harmony. And as he looked across the water, watching the sun dip below the horizon, James knew that he had not only defended his property but had also strengthened the very fabric of the community he loved.